What if I told you that the richest continent on Earth is also one of the poorest? That's right, Africa is home to over $24 trillion in untapped natural resources. Yet millions of its people live on less than $2 a day. Why? Well, the answer lies in a hidden system, a system of loans, debt, and exploitation orchestrated by the very institutions that claim to help: the IMF and the World Bank. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand how this system works, why it persists, and whether there's hope for Africa to break free. Today, we're unpacking how the IMF and World Bank have used debt as a weapon to control Africa's resources and economies. But don't worry, this isn't just a history lesson. We'll also explore the stories of resistance and what needs to change. And hey, before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button and click the bell icon. Trust me, you don't want to miss more deep dives like this. Let's rewind to the 1960s. African countries had just gained independence after decades, or even centuries, of colonial rule. They were finally free to chart their own paths. But there was one problem: they were broke. Years of colonization had drained these nations of their wealth. Infrastructure was in ruins. Healthcare, education, and industry? Practically non-existent. Enter the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, with their promises of salvation. The IMF and World Bank offered loans to help these new nations rebuild and grow. The catch? These weren't gifts. They were loans with interest. Let's put it into perspective. Imagine you take out $1 billion loan to build schools, hospitals, and roads. The interest rate is 8%. At the end of the year, you owe $80 million in interest alone. Sounds manageable, right? But here's the kicker. Building an economy takes time. By the time your first payment is due, you haven't even started making money. So what happens next? When countries couldn't repay their loans, the IMF stepped in with structural adjustment programs. These so-called reforms were supposed to help nations manage their debts. But in reality, they stripped African countries of their economic sovereignty. Here's how it worked: privatization. Governments were forced to sell state-owned industries like mining and energy to foreign investors. Spending cuts. Education, healthcare, and social programs? Slashed. Export-driven economies. Instead of growing food for their people, African nations were pressured to grow cash crops for export. And who benefited from all of this? Western companies. They got cheap access to Africa's resources while African governments were left with skyrocketing debts and struggling populations. The result? By the 1990s, many African countries were trapped in a vicious cycle. They borrowed more money just to pay off old loans. Interest piled up, resources were drained, and poverty worsened. Nowhere is this exploitation more visible than in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. The DRC is one of the most resource-rich countries in the world, with $24 trillion in minerals like gold, cobalt, and copper. But the average Congolese citizen lives on less than $2 a day. How is that even possible? Let's take a quick history lesson. In 1960, the DRC gained independence from Belgium. Their first prime minister, Patrice Lumumba, wanted to nationalize the country's resources, basically, keep the wealth in the hands of the people. But 6 months later, Lumumba was assassinated with help from the CIA and Belgian forces. The West replaced him with a dictator, Joseph Mobutu, who was more cooperative. Under Mobutu, the IMF and World Bank flooded the country with loans. But instead of building schools and hospitals, most of that money disappeared into Mobutu's pockets. Meanwhile, the IMF forced the DRC to privatize its mines, handing control to Western companies. By the 1990s, the DRC was drowning in debt, its resources plundered, and its people left with nothing. But not every country fell into the trap. Botswana, for example, is a shining exception. It never took loans from the IMF and instead used its diamond wealth to build a thriving economy. And Libya, under Muammar Gaddafi, used oil wealth to provide free healthcare, education, and housing. Gaddafi even planned to create an African central bank to challenge the IMF. But when countries resist, they often face backlash, whether it's sanctions, invasions, or outright coups. Still, resistance is growing. In Kenya, citizens are protesting IMF-backed tax hikes. In Niger, the government expelled a French mining company exploiting their uranium. So, what can we do? First, we need to educate ourselves and others about how these systems really work. The more people understand, the harder it becomes for these institutions to operate in secrecy. Second, we can support African-led initiatives for financial independence. That means amplifying voices from the continent and pushing for policies that prioritize people over profit. And here's where you come in. Let's start a conversation. What do you think needs to happen for Africa to break free from this cycle? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if you learned something new, and subscribe for more eye-opening content. Thanks for watching, and remember, knowledge is power. Let's use it wisely.